Picture this. It's the late 1930s. The world is on a knife's edge, and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, Hermann Göring, is making a bold, almost arrogant declaration. As the head of the newly formed Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, Göring was brimming with confidence. He looked at the gleaming new Messerschmitts and Heinkels rolling off the assembly lines, and believed he held an unbeatable hand. He famously declared that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. If one did, he said, "You can call me Meyer," a common Jewish name, which for a top Nazi official was the ultimate admission of failure. This wasn't just empty boasting. This confidence was rooted in a deeply held belief, shared across the Nazi high command. They were convinced that Germany's rearmament, carried out with ruthless efficiency, had given them an insurmountable technological and numerical lead in the skies. The Luftwaffe had been bloodied in the Spanish Civil War, testing its new planes and revolutionary tactics, like the dive-bombing. To them, it seemed obvious. No other nation, especially the democracies they viewed as weak and decadent, could possibly match their industrial might or their military will. They looked at France, still relying on outdated aircraft designs, and Great Britain, which they believed was slow to modernize, and saw no real threat. The United States, it was an ocean away, isolationist, and its military was a shadow of what it would become. Göring's assumption was simple. We've started ahead, so we will stay ahead. The entire strategy for the early years of the war was built on this premise. The concept of blitz, or lightning war, depended on overwhelming air superiority to smash through enemy lines, creating panic and collapse before the opponent could even fully mobilize. For this to work, the Luftwaffe had to be the undisputed king of the skies, knocking out enemy airfields, disrupting communications, and terrorizing ground troops. In the early campaigns, this strategy worked flawlessly. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway were quickly subdued. Then came the stunningly rapid conquest of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Luftwaffe seemed invincible, and Göring's confidence looked like prophetic genius. The world watched in horror as German air power redrew the map of Europe. This initial success only reinforced the German belief that their head start was all that mattered. They were winning, and winning quickly. The idea that someone could not just catch up, but surpass them in aircraft production, seemed utterly absurd. But there was a fatal flaw in this thinking, a catastrophic underestimation of their future enemies. While Göring and his generals were focused on the present, on the planes they had right now, they failed to look at the bigger picture, the latent industrial potential of their adversaries. They saw America's small standing army, not its colossal manufacturing base, that could switch from making cars and refrigerators to tanks and bombers almost overnight. They saw Britain as a small island, not the center of a global empire with vast resources and a grim, bulldog determination. This oversight, this hubris born from early victories, was a seed of their eventual destruction. They were betting on a short war, a sprint where their initial lead would be decisive. They never planned for a marathon, a grinding war of attrition where production numbers would matter more than initial tactics. And that marathon was exactly what they were about to get. Let's dive into the core of this miscalculation. The numbers. In 1939, as the war began, German aircraft production was indeed impressive. They were churning out around 8,000 military aircraft per year. Now, let's look across the Channel. After the fall of France and the dramatic evacuation at Dunkirk, Britain stood alone. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and it would be the first major test of Göring's Luftwaffe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, understood the situation with stark clarity. This wasn't just a battle of pilots. It was a battle of factories. Beaverbrook launched a ferocious, almost tyrannical, campaign to boost aircraft production. He famously called for pots and pans from every household, not because the aluminum was strictly necessary, but as a brilliant propaganda move to galvanize the entire nation into a state of total war. Factory workers put in grueling hours. The designs of the Spitfire and Hurricane, while brilliant, were also optimized for rapid production. Britain's output began to climb steadily. By 1940, the year of the Battle of Britain, the UK outproduced Germany in fighter aircraft. It was a narrow but crucial margin. For every Messerschmitt, Bf-109 that Göring could send over the Channel. Britain was managing to build a Spitfire or Hurricane to meet it. This was the first crack in the German myth of industrial superiority. Göring had expected to grind the Royal Air Force down through attrition, but he found that the RF was replacing its losses faster than he could inflict them. Then, the equation changed dramatically when two sleeping giants entered the fray. First, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Hitler expected another quick victory, another blitzkrieg triumph. He underestimated not only the Red Army's sheer size and willingness to absorb horrific losses, but also the Soviets' ability to relocate their entire industrial base. Entire factories, machinery and all, were packed onto trains and moved hundreds of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers, to the Ural Mountains. There, under brutal conditions, they began churning out aircraft, like the simple, rugged, but effective Ilyushin Iltis. The Soviets would go on to produce over 36,000 of these ground attack aircraft alone, more than Germany's entire combat aircraft production for several years of the war combined. The war on the Eastern Front became a voracious consumer of men and machines, a bleeding wound that the German war economy could never staunch. And then came the biggest giant of all. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. Göring and the Nazi leadership had long dismissed America. They mocked it as a mongrel society, corrupted by jazz and consumerism, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. This was perhaps their single greatest strategic error. The American industrial machine, which had been slowly gearing up through the Lend-Lease program to supply the Allies, now roared to life with a force the world had never seen. The numbers are simply staggering and defy belief even today. In 1939, the U.S. produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number had skyrocketed to over 96,000 aircraft in a single year. That's more than Germany and Japan produced combined at their absolute peak. The Willow Run factory in Michigan, built by Henry Ford, is a perfect example. At its peak, this single factory was rolling a complete B-24 Liberator bomber off the assembly line every hour. Think about that. A four-engine heavy bomber, a complex machine with over 1 million parts, being produced at a rate of 1 per hour, 24 hours a day. Germany, with its focus on specialized craftsmanship, simply could not compete with this scale of mass production. While German factories were being pounded by Allied bombing raids flown by those very bombers Göring swore would never reach Germany. American factories were operating untouched, thousands of miles away. The sky over Germany began to fill with American P-51 Mustangs and B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Lancasters. Göring's confident promise had turned into a nightmare. His Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was being systematically dismantled. It was forced onto the defensive, bled white over the endless plains of Russia and in the skies over its own homeland. The contrast in philosophy was stark. The Germans, particularly in the early war, pursued technological perfection. They developed advanced and sometimes overly complex weapons like the Tiger tank or the Mi-162, the first operational jet fighter. These were formidable weapons, but they were difficult and slow to produce, and a nightmare to maintain in the field. The Allies, particularly the Americans and Soviets, prioritized mass production of good enough equipment. The American M4 Sherman tank, for instance, was outgunned by the German Tiger and Panther tanks. But for every one Tiger the Germans could field, the Allies could field dozens of Shermans. Quantity has a quality all its own, and the Allies had quantity in overwhelming, crushing abundance. The same was true in the air. The Mi-162 jet was revolutionary and could have changed the course of the air war if introduced earlier and in sufficient numbers. But by the time it appeared in 1944, it was too little, too late. There were never enough of them, never enough fuel, and not enough experienced pilots left to fly them against the literal thousands of Allied fighters swarming the skies. Göring's pre-war confidence, which seemed so justified in 1940, had curdled into desperation by 1944. He had started a race believing it was a sprint, only to find himself in an ultramarathon against opponents with limitless stamina. His failure to grasp the industrial potential of the Allies, combined with a rigid, hubristic worldview was a critical factor in the downfall of the Third Reich. The war was ultimately won not just by brave soldiers, sailors, and airmen, but by the factory workers, the engineers, and the sheer unstoppable power of mass production. It's a powerful lesson from history. Never underestimate your opponent, especially their ability to innovate, adapt, and mobilize. The roar of the Luftwaffe in 1939 was deafening, but it was eventually drowned out by the even louder roar of Allied factories. Ever wonder how the tides of World War II truly turned? It wasn't just about battles and generals. A huge, often overlooked factor was something Germany completely miscalculated: America's incredible industrial power. Let's dive into one of the biggest strategic blunders of the 20th century. When the war began, leaders in Berlin looked at the United States and saw a nation seemingly unprepared for a global conflict. They saw an economy focused on consumer goods, a public weary of war after the First World War, and a military that was, frankly, not on the same scale as their own. From their perspective, America was a sleeping giant, but one they believed would take far too long to wake up. They assumed the Atlantic Ocean was a wide enough barrier to keep the U.S. occupied with its own hemisphere, giving Germany free rein to conquer Europe. This was a fatal misjudgment. What they failed to grasp was the sheer scale and, more importantly, the flexibility of the American economy. The United States was sitting on a treasure trove of natural resources: oil, iron, coal, you name it. This wasn't just about having the raw materials. It was about the infrastructure already in place to extract and transport them on a massive scale. The nation's railway networks, highways, and shipping lanes were some of the most developed in the world, ready to be repurposed for the war effort. But the real secret weapon was American manufacturing know-how. Think about it. In the 1920s and 30s, companies like Ford had revolutionized production with a moving assembly line. This wasn't just for making cars. The principles of mass production, standardized parts, specialized labor, and relentless efficiency were deeply ingrained in the American industrial mindset. What German leadership saw as a weakness, the focus on civilian goods, was actually a hidden strength. A factory that could churn out thousands of cars could, with some retooling, churn out thousands of tanks and planes. And that's exactly what happened. The moment the United States entered the war, this incredible transformation began. It was like flipping a giant switch. President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously called for the production of 60,000 planes, 45,000 tanks, and millions of tons of shipping. To the Axis powers, these numbers sounded like pure fantasy, impossible propaganda. To American industrialists, it was a challenge they were uniquely equipped to meet. Car companies stopped making sedans and started building B-24 Liberator bombers. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford, is a legendary example. At its peak, this single factory was rolling a brand new, complex, 4-engine bomber off the assembly line almost every hour. Can you imagine the logistical feat that represents? It was mind-boggling. Shipyards, which had been building commercial vessels, began constructing Liberty ships at an astonishing rate. These weren't fancy warships, but they were the workhorses of the Allied supply chain, using prefabricated sections and welding instead of riveting. Shipyards like those run by Henry J. Kaiser reduced the construction time for a massive cargo ship from months to mere weeks, and in some record-breaking cases, just a few days. This industrial avalanche completely swamped the Axis war machine. While German factories were sophisticated, they couldn't compete with the sheer volume coming out of the United States. For every tank Germany produced, America produced several. For every plane lost, the Allies could replace it far more quickly than the Luftwaffe could. This wasn't just about replacing losses. It was about overwhelming the enemy with numbers. Allied commanders could plan operations knowing they had a deep well of equipment to draw from, a luxury their German counterparts simply didn't have, especially later in the war. Furthermore, American industry wasn't just about quantity. It was also about innovation. The war spurred incredible technological advancements. The development of radar, advancements in aviation like pressurized cabins, the creation of synthetic rubber when natural supplies were cut off. Of this was driven by the marriage of scientific research and industrial might. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, is the ultimate example of this. a colossal undertaking that required organizing resources on a scale never seen before. The social aspect of this mobilization was just as remarkable. Millions of Americans who had never worked in a factory before, including an unprecedented number of women, stepped up to fill the labor gap. The Rosie, the Riveter icon, wasn't just a poster. She represented a real and vital part of the workforce that made this industrial miracle possible. This unified home front, driven by a shared sense of purpose, was another factor the Axis leadership underestimated. They saw a diverse, individualistic society and assumed it couldn't unify for a common cause. They were wrong. So, when we look back at World War II, it's crucial to see beyond the battlefield. The war was also won in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the steel mills of Pennsylvania. The German High Command's failure to appreciate the true potential of American industry was unto just a minor oversight. It was a foundational error in their entire strategic outlook. They thought they were fighting a traditional European war, but they had picked a fight with an industrial superpower that could, and did, outproduce and overwhelm them. It's a powerful lesson in history about not underestimating your opponent, especially when their greatest strength is hidden in plain sight. Ever wonder how a nation sleeping through the early tremors of a world war could wake up and become its decisive force? The story of America's entry into World War II isn't just about battles. It's about a revolution on the home front, an industrial miracle that tipped the scales of history. Let's rewind to late 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a brutal wake-up call. America was in the war, but was it ready for it? The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, had been militarizing for years. Their war machines were well-oiled, battle-tested, and confident. In contrast, the United States was a commercial giant, not a military one. Its strength lay in consumer goods, in cars, refrigerators, and radios. The big question was, could this arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt called it, truly deliver? The world watched, skeptical. Hitler famously dismissed America's industrial potential, believing its consumer-focused economy was too soft, too slow to adapt. He wasn't entirely wrong to doubt. The task was monumental. It wasn't just about building more of what they already had. It was about a total transformation. The challenge was to convert an entire economy, geared for peacetime comfort, into a powerhouse for global conflict. This meant retooling, retraining, and reimagining what American industry was capable of. Think about the sheer scale. Factories that once churned out sleek sedans for Main Street now had to produce rugged tanks for the front lines. Assembly lines that pieced together washing machines were reconfigured to assemble complex aircraft engines. It was a race against time, with the fate of the free world hanging in the balance. The government established the War Production Board in early 1942 to orchestrate this colossal effort. Its job was to halt all civilian automobile production, allocate scarce resources like steel, copper, and rubber, and direct the nation's industrial might toward a single goal: victory. This was more than just a policy change. It was a fundamental shift in the American way of life. The country was about to embark on an industrial mobilization unlike anything the world had ever seen, and it would happen faster and more effectively than anyone, friend or foe, could have ever predicted. Let's zoom in on the auto industry, the heart of American manufacturing. When the government ordered the halt of civilian car production in February 1942, it was a seismic event. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, symbols of American consumerism, were given a new mission. Their expertise in mass production, pioneered by figures like Henry Ford, was now the nation's most valuable strategic asset. Take Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. Originally designed to build cars, it was transformed into a gargantuan factory dedicated to producing the B-24 Liberator bomber. The scale was mind-boggling. At its peak, this single plant was rolling a new, four-engine heavy bomber off the assembly line nearly every hour. It was an assembly line in the sky. This wasn't a simple switch. A B-24 bomber had over 1 million parts, vastly more complex than a car. Yet, these automotive giants applied their methods of efficiency and standardization to military hardware with stunning success. General Motors became the single largest military contractor of the war, producing not just vehicles like tanks and trucks, but also aircraft, machine guns, and shells. It was a testament to the flexibility and ingenuity of American industry. The transformation wasn't limited to just cars and planes. Every corner of the American economy was mobilized. A company famous for making corsets and brassieres started producing parachute harnesses. A toy manufacturer switched from making model trains to producing compasses and bomb fuses. The iconic Underwood typewriter company became one of the world's largest producers of carbine rifles, making millions of them during the war. Even lipstick manufacturers got involved, converting their machinery to fill cartridges with gunpowder. This nationwide pivot created what historians call the production miracle. The numbers are staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, and 12.5 million rifles. American shipyards, which had been quiet for years, roared back to life. Using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques, they built ships at a dizzying pace. The famous Liberty ships, crucial cargo vessels for supplying the Allies, could be built in a matter of weeks, with the record being just under 5 days from keel-laying to launch. This flood of materiel not only equipped America's own rapidly expanding military, but also sustained its allies, including Great Britain and the Soviet Union, through the Lend-Lease program. This industrial output was the engine of the Allied war effort. But this miracle wasn't just about machines and factories. It was about people. With 16 million Americans serving in the military, a massive labor shortage loomed. The solution came from an unexpected source. Women. Posters of Rosie the Riveter with her determined look and flexed bicep became a powerful symbol of a new workforce. Before the war, women in heavy industry were a rarity. But now, millions of women stepped into factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants, taking on jobs that were previously considered men's work. They learned to weld, to rivet, to operate heavy machinery, and they proved they could do it just as well as anyone. This wasn't just a job. It was a patriotic duty. These women, often called Rosies, were instrumental in meeting the nation's incredible production targets. They not only filled the labor gap, but also shattered long-held stereotypes about women's capabilities. Their contribution was absolutely vital. Without them, the production miracle simply would not have happened. They worked long hours in difficult, often dangerous conditions, all while managing households and raising families. Their story is a crucial and often overlooked chapter in the history of the war. The impact of this mobilization on the battlefield was decisive. By 1944, the sheer volume of American production was overwhelming the Axis powers. While German factories were being relentlessly bombed and their resources dwindled, American factories were hitting peak production, safely beyond the reach of enemy bombers. Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen went into battle with an abundance of the best equipment available. A U.S. infantry division had more firepower, more vehicles, and better logistical support than its German or Japanese counterpart. On the Eastern Front, a significant portion of the trucks, trains, and even boots used by the Soviet Red Army were American-made, allowing them to maintain their relentless push toward Berlin. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy's ability to replace ships lost in battle at an astonishing rate was something the Japanese Imperial Navy simply could not match. After the Battle of Midway, Japan never regained the naval advantage, in large part because American shipyards could produce new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could train new pilots, let alone build new ships. In the skies over Europe, swarms of American-built B-17s and B-20, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, systematically dismantled Germany's industrial capacity. Victory in World War II was won not just on the beaches of Normandy or the islands of the Pacific, but also on the assembly lines of Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles. This colossal effort forever changed the United States. The war pulled the country out of the Great Depression, creating millions of jobs and ushering in an era of unprecedented prosperity. The federal government grew enormously in size and scope, taking on a more direct role in managing the economy than ever before. The war also accelerated technological innovation. Research and development funded by the government led to breakthroughs in fields like aviation, electronics, medicine with penicillin, and most famously atomic energy with the Manhattan Project. These innovations would shape the post-war world in profound ways. On a social level, the war challenged traditional roles. The experiences of women in the workforce and African Americans serving in a segregated military and working in defense industries laid crucial groundwork for the civil rights and women's rights movements of the following decades. The United States emerged from the war not just as a victor, but as a global superpower, with its economy and military influence unmatched. The sleeping giant had awakened, and in doing so, it had not only secured victory for the Allies, but had also transformed itself and set the stage for the second half of the 20th century. The legacy of this incredible mobilization is all around us, a powerful reminder of what can be achieved when a nation unites behind a common purpose. Have you ever heard a number so big it just doesn't seem real? Like it has to be a typo or some kind of wartime propaganda? Well, today we're talking about one of those numbers, a figure that represents the sheer, overwhelming industrial might that turned the tide of World War II. The number I'm talking about is 96,318. That's how many aircraft the United States built in a single year, 1944. Let that sink in. Over 96,000 planes. That's more than 260 planes rolling off assembly lines every single day. One new aircraft every 6 minutes. It's a staggering figure, and for decades, people have questioned it. Was it an exaggeration? A morale-boosting lie, cooked up by the government? The answer, unequivocally, is no. This wasn't propaganda. This was the reality of a nation fully mobilized for war. So, how do we know these numbers are real? Well, it's not just based on old government press releases. We have mountains of data to back it up. Historians and economists have spent years digging through factory records, shipping manifests, and military archives. Sources like the official Army Air Force's statistical digests and detailed academic studies all confirm these production totals. Even the BBC, known for its meticulous historical reporting, has presented these figures as fact. What they found wasn't a centralized propaganda machine, but thousands of individual factory reports, each documenting their output, day by day, plane by plane. When you add it all up, the numbers are undeniable. From the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, which at its peak was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, to the countless other factories across the country. The evidence is written in steel, aluminum, and the logbooks of history. To truly grasp the scale of this, let's put it in context. In 1939, on the eve of the war in Europe, the entire U.S. military had fewer than 3,000 aircraft. Most of them were outdated biplanes. The American aviation industry was relatively small. So, how did it go from that to producing nearly 100,000 advanced warplanes in just 5 years? It was a transformation unlike any other in history, a story of innovation, dedication, and sheer industrial power. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a famous 1940 speech, threw down a challenge. He called for the production of 50,000 planes a year. At the time, many inside and outside the country, including some of his own advisors, thought he was crazy. They called the goal fantastical, impossible. Germany's high command scoffed at the idea. They believed their own efficient, state-controlled industry was superior and that the chaotic American democracy could never organize on such a scale. They were wrong, dead wrong. Not only did the U.S. meet Roosevelt's impossible goal, they smashed it. By 1942, they were already producing nearly 80,000 planes. By 1943, it was over 85,000, and then came the peak in 1944 with over 90. Think about the combined production of the Axis powers Germany, Japan, and Italy. In their best year, their total combined aircraft production barely reached half of what the United States was building alone. This wasn't just about building planes, it was about overwhelming the enemy. For every Messerschmitt or Zero that was shot down, America could send 2, 3, or even 4 more to take its place. The Axis powers simply couldn't keep up. Their veteran pilots were being ground down in a war of attrition. They had no hope of winning. They were fighting not just against American pilots, but against an endless sky filled with American machines. This industrial miracle was made possible by a complete overhaul of American manufacturing. The auto industry, the heart of American production, was key. Giants like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler shut down their civilian car production and completely retooled their factories to build planes and plane components. The same assembly line techniques that had put a Model T in every American driveway were now being used to make B-24 bombers and P-51 Mustang fighters. It was a concept the Germans, who relied more on skilled craftsmen, never fully embraced. American manufacturing focused on simplification and modular design. Complex components were broken down into simpler parts that could be built by less skilled workers, many of whom were women who had never worked in a factory before. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. It was the reality for millions who stepped up to build the arsenal of democracy. Let's look at a specific example. The P-51 Mustang. It's arguably one of the greatest fighter planes ever built. Early in the war, its main limitation was its engine performance at high altitudes. But in a brilliant fusion of American and British engineering, the airframe was paired with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was a long-range, high-altitude fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But having a great design is one thing. Producing it in vast numbers is another. Factories like North American Aviation S plants in California and Texas were churning out Mustangs at an incredible rate. By the end of the war, over 15,000 Mustangs had been built. This numerical superiority meant that Allied bombers, which had been suffering devastating losses, now had a little friend to protect them deep inside enemy territory, crippling the German war machine from the air. And it wasn't just fighters and bombers. This production boom included everything. Transport planes like the C-47s, which was the workhorse of airborne operations, patrol bombers, trainers, gliders. The sheer variety was as impressive as the quantity. This massive air fleet allowed the Allies to control the skies over every front, from the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific. It enabled strategic bombing campaigns that dismantled enemy industry, provided crucial air support for ground troops, and blockaded enemy supply lines. The ability to project this much air power anywhere in the world was a direct result of the numbers coming out of American factories. What's truly amazing is that this industrial output was achieved while America was also building ships, tanks, trucks, and guns at an equally mind-boggling rate. The nation transformed into what Roosevelt called the great arsenal of democracy, not just for its own forces, but for its allies. As well, thousands of American-built planes were sent to Britain and the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, bolstering their ability to fight. When you look at the big picture of World War II, you realize that battles weren't just won on the front lines. They were won in the factories, on the assembly lines, by the millions of ordinary people who came together to achieve an extraordinary goal. The number 90,000 planes in a year isn't just a statistic. It's a testament to a nation's capacity for mobilization, innovation, and resolve. It's proof that when faced with an existential threat, a free society could harness its industrial and human potential to achieve the seemingly impossible. Ever wondered how America became the arsenal of democracy during World War II? A huge part of the answer lies not just on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. The secret weapon, the assembly line. It wasn't just about building cars anymore. This was about building a war-winning air force on an unprecedented scale. Picture this. While other nations were crafting planes with almost artisanal methods, the United States was rolling them out like Model Ts. They took everything they learned from the automotive industry, standardized parts, specialized tasks, a constantly moving line, and applied it to building complex war machines like the B-24 Liberator. One of the most incredible examples was Henry Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. At its peak, this single factory was churning out a fully completed, 4-engine heavy bomber almost every single hour. Can you even imagine that? An entire bomber, ready to fly every 60 minutes. This approach was revolutionary. As the historian Adam Tooze points out, the American method of mass production had 3 massive advantages. It slashed costs, it dramatically increased speed, and it allowed for almost unlimited scaling. Need more planes? Just add another shift, speed up the line, and build another factory. It was a system built for exponential growth. Workers, many of whom had never built anything more complicated than a kitchen radio, were trained to do one specific job over and over. One person installs a specific set of rivets, the next person wires a particular panel, and so on. Down the line, this division of labor meant that a complex aircraft could be assembled by a workforce that did not need years of specialized training. Now, let's contrast this with Germany. The Germans built incredible aircraft. No doubt about it. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were fearsome machines, engineered to perfection, but their production philosophy was fundamentally different. It was more like a craftsman's workshop. They focused on high quality, but their production systems were fragmented. Different parts were made in different places, often with less standardization, and their resource base was much smaller. They were struggling to get the raw materials, the alumina, the rubber, the high-grade steel that America had in abundance. So, while German engineers were perfecting their designs, American factories were simply overwhelming them with sheer numbers. It did not matter if a single German plane was 10% better if the Americans could produce 10 planes for every one of theirs. This is what we call assembly line warfare. It was a war of logistics, of production capacity, of industrial might. The United States wasn't just fighting with soldiers, it was fighting with its entire economic engine. The scale is just mind-boggling. In 1939, the U.S. produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number had exploded to over 96,000 in a single year. That's more than the combined output of Germany and Japan for the entire war. Think about the logistics behind that. Every single one of those planes needed engines, propellers, radios, machine guns, and thousands upon thousands of individual parts, all arriving at the right place at the right time. It wasn't just about building new planes, either. The same assembly line principles were applied to repair and maintenance. Damaged aircraft returning from combat could be quickly disassembled, repaired with standardized replacement parts, and sent back to the front lines faster than ever before. This kept more planes in the air and gave Allied forces a significant advantage in attrition warfare. Germany's industrial planners saw this happening, but they simply couldn't compete. They were constrained by bombing raids on their factories, severe resource shortages, and an industrial philosophy that prized perfection over mass quantity. They tried to streamline their own production later in the war, but it was too little, too late. The American industrial tidal wave was already cresting. This shift in production philosophy had a massive social impact as well. With so many men going off to fight, who was building all these planes? It was women. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, it was the reality on the factory floor. Millions of women entered the workforce, taking on jobs that were previously considered men's work. They became welders, electricians, and mechanics, proving they could build bombers just as well as anyone. They were the unsung heroes of the production line, the ones who truly powered the arsenal of democracy. So, when we look back at how the air war in Europe and the Pacific was won, we have to look beyond the dogfights and bombing raids. The victory was forged in places like Willow Run, Michigan, and Wichita, Kansas. It was a victory of systems, of organization, and of the American belief that any problem, no matter how big, could be solved with ingenuity and industrial power. The assembly line didn't just build planes. It built the foundation for Allied victory. It proved that in modern warfare, the factory floor is just as important as the front line. When we think of World War II, our minds often jump to the iconic machines. The Roarings, the mighty B-17 flying fortresses, the formidable Sherman tanks. These were the steel titans that clashed on the battlefields, in the skies, and across the seas. But have you ever stopped to wonder who built them? Not the famous engineers or the generals, but the ordinary people who turned blueprints into reality. The story of World War II isn't just one of soldiers. It's a story of millions of civilians who waged a war of production, a battle of rivets and wrenches, right here on the home front. This is the story of the human factor, the secret weapon that truly powered the Allied victory. Let's rewind to the late 1930s. The world was on the brink of war, and the United States was industrially unprepared. Its army was smaller than Portugal's, and its aircraft production was minimal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew this had to change. In a famous fireside chat, He called for America to become the arsenal of democracy. He set an audacious goal: 50,000 airplanes a year. Too many. It sounded impossible. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression, and the industrial base for such a massive undertaking simply didn't exist. Where would the factories come from? More importantly, where would the workers come from? The answer came from the American people. As millions of men enlisted and went off to fight, a massive labor vacuum was created. Who would fill it? The answer was revolutionary. Millions of people who had never set foot in a factory before stepped up, and most notably, this new workforce included a huge number of women. This was a seismic shift in society. Before the war, the idea of women working in heavy industry, building bombers and battleships, was almost unthinkable. But necessity is the mother of invention, and in this case, it was the mother of a social and industrial revolution. These women, immortalized by the Rosie the Riveter propaganda campaign, came from all walks of life. They were homemakers, secretaries, shopgirls, and students. They left their homes and kitchens for the clang and clamor of the factory floor. They learned to weld, to rivet, to operate complex machinery, and to assemble the intricate components of war machines. It wasn't easy. The work was physically demanding, often dangerous, and the hours were long. They faced skepticism and sometimes outright hostility from their male counterparts who doubted their abilities. But they proved everyone wrong. Let's look at the Library of Congress archives, which hold a treasure trove of photos and films from this era. You can see the transformation firsthand. There are images of training programs designed to turn a novice into a skilled aircraft worker in just a few weeks. These weren't simple jobs. Building a B-24 Liberator bomber, for example, involved over 1 million individual parts. It was a symphony of complex coordination. Yet, these training programs were incredibly effective. They broke down massive, complex tasks into smaller, manageable steps. A new worker might first learn just how to drill a perfect hole, then how to set a rivet, then how to assemble a small subcomponent. Through this modular training, inexperienced workers could quickly become specialists in one part of the assembly line, contributing effectively to the overall effort without needing years of apprenticeship. The scale of this operation is staggering. Take the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by the Ford Motor Company. At its peak, this single factory was churning out a B-24 bomber almost every hour. It was over 1 mile long, and its assembly line was the largest in the world. To make this possible, Ford applied the same mass production principles he had perfected for the Model T, but instead of cars, he was building one of the most complex aircraft of the war. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them women who had moved from all over the country, lived in purpose-built housing and worked around the clock in 3 shifts. This factory became a symbol of American industrial might, a city dedicated to a single purpose: winning the war. But it wasn't just about planes. The same story unfolded in shipyards across the country. The Liberty ships, a class of simple cargo vessels, were another production marvel, using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques. Shipyards like those run by Henry J. Kaiser slashed construction time from months to weeks, and in some famous cases, to just a matter of days. Workers, again including many women, welded massive steel plates together, working high on scaffolding in all weather conditions. These ships were the lifeline of the Allied war effort, carrying troops, tanks, food, and fuel across the treacherous Atlantic and Pacific. Without this bridge of ships, the invasions of North Africa, Italy, and ultimately Normandy would have been impossible. The human factor wasn't just about skill and labor. It was also about innovation and morale. Factory floors became hotbeds of ingenuity. Workers would often come up with small modifications or new tools to make their jobs faster and safer. Suggestion boxes were filled with ideas that, when implemented, could shave precious minutes off production time. This bottom-up innovation was a crucial, often overlooked, part of the production miracle. Morale was everything. Propaganda posters, bond drives, and newsreels constantly reminded workers that their efforts were directly tied to the soldiers on the front lines. A missed rivet could mean a failed plane. A slow day on the assembly line could mean a delay in supplies for troops overseas. This created an incredible sense of purpose and unity. They weren't just building machines. They were building victory. They were saving lives. This psychological motivation was just as important as any engineering diagram. The legacy of this period is immense. For one, it shattered traditional gender roles and paved the way for women's expanded role in the post-war economy. Many women returned to domestic life after the war, but the door had been opened, and the world had seen what they were capable of. The Rosie the Riveters not only built bombers, they also built a new future for their daughters and granddaughters. Furthermore, the war effort perfected mass production on an unprecedented scale. The logistical and manufacturing techniques honed in the factories of World War II were later applied to the post-war consumer boom, creating the cars, appliances, and homes that defined mid-century American prosperity. The arsenal of democracy became the engine of the global economy. So, the next time you see a picture of a P-51 Mustang or a newsreel of a ship launching, remember the hands that built it. Remember the millions of ordinary men and women who traded their daily routines for the factory floor. They were the farmers, the clerks, the housewives, and the students who answered the call. They operated the lathes, drove the rivets, and welded the seams. They were the human engine behind the war machine, the unsung heroes whose sweat and determination forged the tools of victory. Their story is a powerful reminder that wars are not won by machines alone, but by the people who build them, believe in them, and poured their very souls into their creation. Have you ever wondered what really turned the tide in the skies over World War II? It wasn't just about a few heroic dogfights. It was about something much, much bigger. The sheer, unstoppable flood of American aircraft pouring into Europe. This industrial might didn't just give the Allies an edge. It completely transformed the air war. Imagine this. For every plane the Luftwaffe shot down, it felt like two more appeared on the horizon. This wasn't just an exaggeration. It was the brutal reality the German pilots faced. The Allied air forces, powered by American factories, could sustain relentless, long-term bombing campaigns. They could launch deep penetration escort missions and provide constant tactical support for ground troops. This wasn't a war of single battles anymore. It was a war of attrition, and the Allies were winning it decisively in the air. This ability to continuously replace losses was the secret weapon that allowed them to grind down the German defenses. Mission after mission, day after day. Let's dive deeper into what this meant on a practical level. Think about the strategic bombing campaigns, missions to cripple German war production factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs were incredibly dangerous. Early in the war, bomber losses were devastatingly high, but with the influx of American planes, especially long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the game changed. These little friends, as the bomber crews called them, could escort the heavy bombers all the way to their targets and back. This dramatically reduced bomber losses and allowed for more frequent and more effective raids. The constant pressure from the sky meant Germany's ability to produce tanks, ammunition, and fuel was being systematically choked off. The Luftwaffe was forced into a purely defensive war, constantly scrambling to intercept massive bomber formations, which wore down their experienced pilots and depleted their dwindling supply of aircraft. The impact wasn't just felt deep within Germany, it was crucial on the front lines as well. Tactical air support became a cornerstone of Allied ground operations. Aircraft, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, a rugged and heavily armed fighter bomber, became the ground troops' best friend. They could strafe enemy columns, bomb strong points, and disrupt supply lines just behind the front. This air-ground coordination was devastating. German soldiers lived in constant fear of attack from above. This not only caused physical destruction, but also had a massive psychological effect, shattering morale and making any daytime movement a deadly gamble. The Normandy landings, for instance, would have been impossible without complete Allied air superiority. The skies were cleared of German planes, allowing the invasion force to land and establish a beachhead with far less opposition from the air than they might have otherwise faced. The ability to replace lost planes meant this air umbrella could be maintained indefinitely. So, how did America achieve this incredible production feat? It was a story of total mobilization. Factories that once made cars were retooled to build bombers. The workforce, famously including Rosie the Riveter, swelled with millions of Americans determined to contribute to the war effort. Innovations in mass production, like the moving assembly line, were applied to aircraft manufacturing with breathtaking efficiency. At its peak, the Willow Run plant, for example, was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber almost every hour. This industrial tsunami was something the Axis powers simply couldn't match. Germany's production, while technologically advanced, was hampered by bureaucracy, competing interests, and, of course, the constant Allied bombing that American planes made possible. It created a vicious cycle for the Germans. The more they needed to defend against bombers, the fewer resources they had for their own production, which was then further degraded by more bombing. The strategic consequences were profound. By gaining and maintaining air superiority, the Allies dictated the time and place of battles. They blinded the German army by destroying its reconnaissance capabilities and paralyzed its movements by severing supply lines. The relentless air campaign was, in many ways, a second front long before the dyed landings. It forced Germany to divert enormous resource anti-aircraft guns, fighter squadrons, and hundreds of thousands of personnel to defend the homeland. These were resources that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union or in France to repel the eventual invasion. The war in the air wasn't just a supporting act. It was a central pillar of the entire Allied strategy. The flood of American aircraft didn't just add to the Allied arsenal. It created a fundamental imbalance that the German war machine could not overcome. It was a testament to the idea that modern wars are won not just by brave soldiers, but by the factories and workers who supply them. The sky over Europe became a symbol of Allied power, a constant, looming presence that signaled the inevitable defeat of the Third Reich. It proved that in the 20th century, industrial might was the ultimate weapon of war. Imagine this. It's the height of World War II, and the skies over Germany are buzzing, not with a few planes, but with thousands upon thousands of Allied bombers. We often talk about the physical destruction these raids caused. The cities turned to rubble, the factories smashed. But what about the psychological war? What was going through the minds of the Nazi leadership as they watched this relentless aerial armada darken their skies? Today, we're diving deep into the hidden history, using captured German documents and post-war interrogations to uncover the profound psychological impact of the Allied bombing campaign on the very people who started the war. Thanks to the meticulous work of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war, we have a treasure trove of insights. They didn't just look at bomb craters. They interrogated high-ranking German officials, from Albert Speer, the Minister of Armament, to Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. They combed through secret memos, diary entries, and official reports. What they found was a fascinating, and ultimately fatal, story of disbelief, denial, and despair. In the early years of the war, the Nazi leadership was brimming with confidence. Göring had famously boasted that if a single enemy bomber ever reached the Ruhr, people could call him Meyer, a common German name, basically saying it would never happen. This arrogance was built on the early successes of their own Luftwaffe in Poland and France. They believed their air force was invincible, and that Germany itself was an untouchable fortress. They completely underestimated the industrial might of their adversaries, particularly the United States. Initial Allied raids were relatively small and often costly. The Germans saw these as pinpricks, annoyances rather than a genuine threat. Their propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, worked overtime to downplay the damage and paint a picture of German resilience and strength. They celebrated their fighter pilots as modern-day knights, shooting down Allied bombers and protecting the homeland. For a while, this narrative held. The German public, and even many within the leadership, believed they could weather the storm. But then, the tide began to turn. Slowly at first, and then, like a flood, the numbers became impossible to ignore. American factories, safe from bombing, were churning out aircraft at a rate that seemed almost fantastical to the German high command. Reports started filtering in, not of dozens of enemy planes, but hundreds, then 1,000. The 1,000-bomber raids on cities like Cologne were a profound shock. The sheer scale was something they had never anticipated. This is where the psychological cracks started to show. Captured documents reveal a growing sense of alarm. Internal memos began to question the official reports. There was a stark contradiction between the propaganda being fed to the public and the grim reality unfolding in the skies. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs and interrogations, spoke at length about this. He described meetings where Hitler would fly into a rage, refusing to believe the production figures coming out of America. He called them exaggerated, impossible bluffs. This denial was a coping mechanism. To accept the reality of Allied production numbers would be to accept that the war was It meant that for every German fighter they built, the Allies were building 10 more. For every bomber they shot down, 20 more would take its place. The math was simple, brutal, and terrifying for them. Göring, the once boastful leader of the Luftwaffe, became a target of Hitler's fury. The failure to protect Germany's skies was laid squarely at his feet. His influence waned, and he retreated into a world of luxury and denial, a shadow of his former self. The psychological pressure wasn't just about numbers. It was about the nature of the threat. An army on the ground advances along a front line. You can see it, track it, and build defenses against it. But a threat from the air is different. It can come from any direction, at any time, day or night. It bypasses traditional defenses and strikes directly at the heartland. This created a pervasive sense of vulnerability and helplessness that seeped into the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Think about the daily routine of a high-ranking official in Berlin. They would wake up, check the reports from the front, and then look to the skies. The air raid sirens became the soundtrack to their lives. T.A. deep. Reinforced bunkers. Of course, far more protection than the average citizen. But they couldn't escape the knowledge that their entire war machine, the factories, the oil refineries, the transportation networks, were being systematically dismantled from above. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey highlights a critical moment, the shift in Allied strategy to target Germany's synthetic oil production. This was without fuel, the tanks couldn't move, the U-boats couldn't sail, and most importantly, the Luftwaffe couldn't fly. Speer himself identified this as the single most decisive factor in Germany's defeat. He repeatedly warned Hitler that if the oil plants were destroyed, the war would be over in a matter of months. The documents show a frantic, desperate attempt to counter this strategy. They tried to disperse production, build underground factories, and throw everything they had into anti-aircraft defenses. But it was too little, too late. The sheer volume of the Allied air fleets was overwhelming. For every gun emplacement they built, the Allies could simply send more planes, absorbing the losses and pushing through to their targets. This relentless pressure created a sense of futility. It was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. This feeling of powerlessness had a corrosive effect on morale and discipline. The leadership became more erratic, more prone to wishful thinking. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his bunker, demanded miracle weapons, the V1 and V2 rockets, believing they could turn the tide and terrorize Britain into submission. While these weapons were technologically advanced and caused fear, they were strategically insignificant. They couldn't stop the Allied bomber streams. They were weapons of desperation, born from the psychological need to hit back at an enemy they couldn't otherwise reach. The internal blame game intensified. Generals blamed the Luftwaffe. Göring blamed his pilots and his industrial planners. Everyone blamed Speer for not producing enough, and Speer, in turn, blamed the others for not giving him the resources he needed. This infighting, fueled by the constant stress of the air war, paralyzed effective governance and military strategy. The cohesive, confident leadership of the early war years disintegrated into a squabbling paranoid clicker. Post-war interrogations paint a vivid picture of this collapse. German leaders admitted that the constant threat from the air wore them down. It wasn't just the fear of being bombed themselves. It was the gnawing anxiety of watching their country and their war effort being ground into dust from 20,000 feet. They knew that the reports of destroyed factories and crippled transportation meant that the soldiers on the front lines would soon be without ammunition, without reinforcements, and without air cover. One of the most powerful revelations from the bombing survey was the German leadership's own assessment. When asked what the single most important reason for their defeat was, the answer wasn't the invasion of Normandy or the fighting on the Eastern Front. As crucial as they were, overwhelmingly, the captured leaders pointed to the sky. They pointed to the Allied air offensive that had broken the back of their industry, shattered their logistics, and, perhaps most importantly, crushed their will to fight. It's a stark reminder that modern warfare is fought on multiple fronts. The battle for the skies over Germany was not just a battle of machines and explosives. It was a battle of production lines, of logistics, and critically, a battle for the mind. The Allies, by demonstrating an industrial capacity that the Nazi leadership thought impossible, created a psychological crisis from which the Third Reich could never recover. The constant drone of bombers was the death knell of their ambitions, a sound that signaled not just physical destruction, but the complete and utter failure of their entire worldview. When you think of the weapons of World War II, what comes to mind? The iconic Sherman tank, the powerful B-17 Flying Fortress, or maybe the formidable aircraft carriers that ruled the Pacific. But what if I told you that the single most decisive weapon in the Allied arsenal wasn't a gun, a plane, or a ship? What if it was something far less glamorous, yet infinitely more powerful? The American factory. Modern historians are increasingly framing the war not just as a clash of armies, but as a battle of economies. And in that battle, American industry was the ultimate superweapon. The sheer scale of what was achieved is imagine a country still reeling from the Great Depression, suddenly transforming its civilian factories into an unstoppable engine of war. Car manufacturers started churning out tanks. Refrigerator companies built machine guns, and shipyards, once quiet, were now launching vessels at a pace the world had never seen. This wasn't just about making a lot of stuff. It was about overwhelming the enemy with a relentless tidal wave of material. Let's put this into perspective. In the 4 years of its involvement, the United States produced an astonishing 300,000 aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, and 2 million Army trucks. The numbers are so large, they almost lose meaning. But think about it this way. For every 1 tank the Germans produced, the U.S. and its allies produced nearly 4. This industrial might created a strategic reality that was impossible for the Axis powers to overcome. They weren't just fighting soldiers on the battlefield. They were fighting the assembled lines of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the aircraft plants of Seattle. The story of the Liberty ships is a perfect example of this industrial miracle. Before the war, building a large cargo ship could take the better part of a year. But under the pressure of war, American shipyards, led by innovators like Henry J. Kaiser, revolutionized the process. They used prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques. The result, at their peak, they were launching a new ship every single day. Some ships were even built in under 5 days. This bridge of ships across the Atlantic was the lifeline that kept Britain and the Soviet Union in the fight, delivering everything from food and fuel to tanks and ammunition. German U-boats could sink ships, and they did, but they could never sink them faster than America could build them. It was a war of attrition, and America was winning it with welding torches and rivet guns. This concept, the idea of production itself as a weapon, fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. Let's focus on the air war. Early in the conflict, the German Luftwaffe was a terrifyingly efficient force with experienced pilots and advanced aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-189. They achieved air superiority over much of Europe, but as the war dragged on, a new equation emerged. An American pilot might get shot down. A B-17 might be lost over Germany. But back home, dozens more were rolling off the assembly line to take their place. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, a colossal factory built specifically for the B-24 Liberator bomber, was, at its peak, producing 1 bomber every hour. Think about that. Every 60 minutes, another 4-engine heavy bomber was ready for combat. The German high command was acutely aware of this. They knew they couldn't match this output. Their own war economy, while formidable, was stretched thin and constantly under attack from Allied bombing raids. They had brilliant engineers and skilled workers, but they simply lacked the resources, the security of their industrial base, and the sheer scale to compete. A German ace pilot might shoot down 5 Allied planes, but if the Allies could produce 50 in the time it took Germany to produce 5, the tactical victory was strategically meaningless. The balance of power was shifting, not just through dogfights in the sky, but through production schedules on the ground. Air superiority became a matter of economic endurance. Who could replace their losses faster? The answer was resoundingly the United States. This industrial advantage had a profound psychological impact as well. For Allied soldiers, seeing the endless supply of new equipment was a huge morale booster. It was tangible proof that a mighty nation was behind them. For Axis soldiers, it was the opposite. Imagine fighting on the Eastern Front, short on supplies, and seeing wave after wave of American-made Sherman tanks or Studebaker trucks being used by the Red Army. It must have been incredibly demoralizing. They were facing not just an army, but an entire industrial continent that seemed to have limitless resources. This wasn't just about big-ticket items like planes and tanks. It was about everything. Boots, uniforms, rifles, ammunition, canned food, medical supplies. The American GI was the best-equipped soldier in the world, and that was a direct result of the nation's ability to produce and transport goods on an unprecedented scale. The logistics of supplying millions of troops across 2 oceans is a feat that's almost as impressive as the production numbers themselves. It required a level of organization and industrial capacity that no other nation could muster. So, how did this happen? It was a combination of factors. America had a vast pool of natural resources, a large and skilled workforce significantly bolstered by women entering the factories in roles they'd never held before, the famous Rosie the Riveters, and a culture of innovation and mass production that was already business leaders, engineers, and government officials came together in a remarkable partnership. The rivalry of the free market was temporarily set aside for the common goal of national survival. It was a total mobilization of society. When we look back at World War II, it's easy to get caught up in the drama of the battles, the genius of the generals, and the bravery of the soldiers. And all of that is incredibly important. But we can't forget the silent, relentless war being fought on the factory floors. It was a war of numbers, of logistics, of production quotas. And in that war, the American worker, armed with a wrench or a welding torch, was as vital to victory as any soldier on the front lines. The ability to outproduce and outsustain the enemy was the ultimate strategic advantage. It proved that in modern, total war, the roar of the factory can be just as powerful as the roar of the cannon. The sheer weight of American steel, aluminum, and rubber tipped the scales and helped secure the Allied victory. It's a crucial and often overlooked chapter in the story of the Second World War. When we think about World War II, we often picture dramatic dogfights, epic tank battles, and heroic soldiers storming beaches. These images are powerful, and they tell an important part of the story. But behind every pilot in a Spitfire, every tanker in a Sherman, and every soldier on the front lines, there was a different kind of war being fought, a war of numbers, of logistics, of rivets and steel. This was the Industrial War, and it's where the ultimate fate of the conflict was truly decided. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this hidden battlefield and explore a lesson that goes far beyond military strategy. It's the story of how an entire nation transformed itself into an unstoppable engine of production, and how this industrial might ultimately crush an enemy that seemed, at first, invincible. Let's rewind to the early days of the war. In 1940, Hermann Göring, the head of Germany's Luftwaffe, was brimming with confidence. His air force had swept across Europe, seemingly unstoppable. He famously boasted that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich. From his perspective, the war was already won. Germany had pioneered new tactics like the Blitzkrieg, and their military technology was they had the will, the ideology, and the initial momentum. What more could they possibly need? But while Göring was basking in the glow of early victories across the Atlantic, something monumental was stirring. In May 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before the U.S. Congress and made a request that sounded too many, completely insane. He called for the nation to produce 50,000 airplanes per year. Let's put that number into perspective. At the time, the entire American aircraft industry was producing maybe a few thousand planes annually. Germany, at the peak of its early war production, was making around 10,000 to 12,000 a year. So, 50,000, it was an astronomical figure. Göring himself, upon hearing the news, reportedly laughed it off, calling it sheer propaganda. He couldn't conceive of such a number. To him, it was just another example of American bluffing. But it wasn't a bluff. It was a declaration of intent. Roosevelt understood something that Göring and the Nazi leadership fundamentally missed. He knew that modern warfare wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of economies. It was a battle of production lines, supply chains, and industrial capacity. The initial victories of the Blitzkrieg were impressive, but they were like a sprinter starting a marathon. The real race was about endurance. What happened next was nothing short of an industrial miracle. The United States, still reeling from the Great Depression, began to mobilize its economic power on a scale never seen before. The slogan, "The Arsenal of Democracy," wasn't just rhetoric. It became a tangible reality. Automobile factories, which had once churned out family sedans, were completely retooled. Giants like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler stopped making cars almost overnight. Their assembly lines, famous for efficiency, were converted to build engines, tanks, and, of course, airplanes. One of the most incredible examples was the Willow Run factory in Michigan, built by Henry Ford. This plant was designed from the ground up to apply his revolutionary assembly line techniques to aircraft manufacturing. Before this, planes were largely built by hand, a slow, meticulous process. Ford envisioned a factory where raw materials would come in one end, and a finished B-4 Liberator bomber would roll out the other. Ready for flight, the scale of Willow Run was staggering. It was the largest factory building under one roof in the world at the time. At its peak, the assembly line was over a mile long. After sorting out some initial, very difficult production hurdles, the factory began to hit its stride. By 1944, Willow Run was producing a new B-4 bomber approximately every 63 minutes. Think about that. A complex, 4-engine heavy bomber, rolling off the line nearly every hour, 24 hours a day. And this was just one factory. Similar stories were unfolding all across the country. In California, shipyards that once took a year to build a single freighter were now launching Liberty ships, the workhorses of the Allied supply chain, in a matter of weeks, and in some record-breaking cases, in just a few days. Women, who had largely been excluded from industrial work, poured into the factories, becoming the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who were the backbone of this production boom. By 1944, the United States wasn't just meeting Roosevelt's insane goal of 50,000 planes a year. It was nearly doubling it. In that single year, American factories produced over 96,000 aircraft. Meanwhile, what was happening in Germany? Göring's early confidence had begun to collide with a harsh industrial reality. The German war economy was powerful, but it was also riddled with it was never fully mobilized for a long-term, total war of attrition. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, made significant efforts to streamline and increase production later in the war, and German output did rise impressively. But it was too little, too late. They were constantly playing catch-up against an opponent whose industrial base was simply on another level. Furthermore, German industry was now under relentless attack. Those Allied bombers, built in factories like Willow Run, were flying over Germany day and night, systematically dismantling the very industrial infrastructure of oil refineries. The ball-bearing plants, the aircraft factories that the German war machine depended on. Göring's boast that no bombs would fall on the Reich had become a bitter, tragic joke. The sheer quantity of Allied aircraft meant they could sustain losses and still keep coming back, day after day, grinding down Germany's ability to fight. This brings us to the core lesson, the one that extends far beyond the battlefields of World War II wars. Especially modern, total wars are not won by ideology alone. They are not won by early tactical brilliance or the supposed superiority of one's soldiers. Those things matter, of course, but they are ultimately dwarfed by the unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work of logistics, economic organization, and industrial capacity. The story of aircraft production is the perfect microcosm of this truth. Germany started the war with a superior air force in many respects, with battle-hardened pilots and excellent planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. They won stunning victories in Poland, France, and across Europe. But they couldn't replace their losses at the same rate as the Allies. For every experienced German pilot lost, it was a blow to a limited pool of talent. For every Bf 109 shot down, its replacement had to come from a strained industrial base. On the other side, the Allies, particularly the United States, could absorb staggering losses and keep fighting. They had a seemingly endless stream of planes, tanks, ships, and supplies flowing from their factories. A pilot might be lost, but there were 10 more being trained to take his place, and 100 more planes waiting for them on the tarmac. It was a brutal, attritional calculus, and the side with the bigger ledger was destined to win. This principle is what military strategists call the sinews of war. It is the idea that an army's strength is ultimately dependent on the economic and industrial power that supports it. You can have the best general in the world, but if his troops have no bullets, no food, and no fuel, he cannot win. Göring's fatal miscalculation was believing that the initial momentum and ideological fervor of Nazism could defy the fundamental laws of industrial warfare. He and the Nazi leadership were blinded by their own propaganda, believing in a short, sharp war that would be won by sheer force of will. They were unprepared for a long, grinding conflict where the deciding factor wouldn't be fighting spirit, but the number of tons of steel that could be turned into weapons each month. So, when we look back at World War II, let's remember the pilots in the sky and the soldiers on the ground, but let's also remember the millions of workers on the home front, the engineers who designed the assembly lines, and the planners who organized the logistics. They were fighting a different kind of battle, one measured in production quotas and shipping schedules. It was a battle that was less dramatic, perhaps, but no less decisive. The story of the 50,000 airplanes is a powerful reminder that victory is often forged not in the fire of battle, but in the fires of industry. It teaches us that long-term strength, resilience, and the ability to organize and mobilize resources are what ultimately triumph over short-term gains and hollow confidence. It's a lesson about the true engine of history, and it's as relevant today as it was 80 years ago.